Sometimes the most broken souls find healing in the most unexpected places. When a woman's world crumbles beneath the weight of abuse and betrayal, she discovers that salvation can come from the calloused hands of a stranger who sees her worth when she can't see it herself. This is a story about finding love when you've forgotten how to trust, about healing when you've forgotten how to hope, and about discovering that sometimes the person meant to save you has been waiting just as long to be saved. What happens when a battered woman, running from her past with nothing but the clothes on her back, stumbles onto a ranch where a lonely cowboy is about to change both their lives forever? Some meetings are destiny. Some rescues go both ways. And sometimes, when someone drops to one knee, it's not just to propose. It's to lift someone up from the lowest point of their life. This is that story. The gravel cut into Sarah's bare feet as she stumbled down the dark country road. But the pain felt distant compared to the throbbing in her ribs and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Each step sent sharp stones deeper into her soles. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she'd finally found the courage to leave. The moon hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway that stretched endlessly before her. She pulled the torn cardigan tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the purple bruises that decorated her arms like some twisted artwork. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, and she could feel dried blood crackling at the corner of her mouth when she tried to speak. "Don't look back," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible in the still night air. "Don't you dare look back." But she did look back, just once, to see the distant glow of headlights far behind her on the horizon. Her stomach lurched with terror. Marcus had discovered she was gone. The beating she'd received 3 hours ago for burning his dinner would seem like a gentle caress compared to what awaited her if he caught her now. Sarah had been planning this escape for months, hiding a $20 bill here, a $5 there, whenever Marcus wasn't watching. The small collection of crumpled bills in her pocket represented 6 months of careful planning and desperate hope. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be enough for a bus ticket to anywhere but here. The plan had been simple. Wait until Marcus passed out drunk after his weekly poker game, slip out the back door, and walk the 3 miles to town. The bus station stayed open all night on Fridays, and she knew the schedule by heart. The 2:47 a.m. bus to Dallas. Then, connections to anywhere she could afford. A new life. A chance to be someone other than Marcus Hartley's punching bag. But everything had gone wrong from the moment she'd stepped outside. First, she'd forgotten about the dogs. Marcus kept 3 German shepherds chained in the backyard, and their barking had nearly given her away. She'd managed to quiet them with the leftover pot roast from dinner, but the delay had cost her precious time. Then, halfway to town, she'd realized she'd grabbed the wrong jacket from the closet. Instead of her own thin windbreaker with her carefully hidden money sewn into the lining, she'd taken one of Marcus's old hunting jackets. Now she had only the change from her pocket, exactly $4.37, and 3 miles still to go before she reached town. The headlights behind her were getting closer. Sarah's bare feet were bleeding now, leaving small dark spots on the asphalt with each step. She'd lost her shoes somewhere in the chaos of leaving, probably kicked them off in her haste to get out the door before Marcus woke up. The September night air was cooler than she'd expected, and her thin pajama pants and tank top offered little protection against the chill. A coyote howled in the distance, the sound echoing across the empty landscape and making her jump. She'd lived in Texas all her life, but she'd never been alone in the countryside like this. Marcus had kept her isolated on his property for the past 2 years, rarely allowing her to leave except for supervised trips to the grocery store in town. She knew there were other houses scattered throughout the area, but they were set far back from the road, hidden behind gates and long driveways. The headlights were definitely getting closer now. Sarah could hear the low rumble of an engine in the distance, and her heart began to pound so hard she was sure it would burst from her chest. She looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the road stretched through an endless expanse of scrubland and prairie grass. There were no trees large enough to conceal her, no buildings or structures of any kind. Then she saw it. A narrow dirt road branching off to the right, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Lazy J Ranch in faded red letters. Without thinking, Sarah turned down the drive, hoping it would lead somewhere she could hide until Marcus passed by. The driveway was longer than she'd expected, winding through pasture land dotted with the dark shapes of sleeping cattle. Her feet were numb with cold now, and she could barely feel the stones and dried cattle tracks beneath them. Blood loss and exhaustion were making her dizzy, and twice she stumbled and nearly fell. The headlights of Marcus's truck swept past the entrance to the ranch road without slowing, and Sarah felt a moment of relief, so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. But the relief was short-lived. She was still miles from town, with no shoes, no money, and no idea where this ranch road might lead. For all she knew, she was walking deeper into the wilderness, farther from any hope of help. The driveway curved around a small hill, and suddenly, Sarah could see lights ahead, the warm yellow glow of windows in what looked like a large farmhouse. There were several other buildings nearby, a barn, some kind of workshop, and what might have been a bunkhouse. She could hear the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, and the creak of a windmill turning in the gentle breeze. Sarah hesitated at the edge of the yard, suddenly aware of how she must look. A strange woman stumbling onto someone's property in the middle of the night, barefoot and bloodied, wearing pajamas and a man's hunting jacket. They would either call the police or assume she was some kind of criminal. Or worse, they might know Marcus and send her straight back to him. But she didn't have a choice. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she could feel consciousness slipping away at the edges. If she didn't find help soon, she would collapse right here in this stranger's driveway. She forced herself to walk toward the house, each step requiring enormous effort. The porch light was on, and she could see a pair of muddy boots by the front door, a rocking chair, and some kind of farming equipment she couldn't identify. Everything about the place suggested working people, the kind who got up before dawn and earned their living with their hands. Sarah raised her fist to knock on the door, then hesitated. What would she say? How could she possibly explain her situation to complete strangers? But before she could decide, the door opened, and she found herself face to face with the tallest man she'd ever seen. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and hands that looked like they could break a horse. His dark hair was mussed from sleep, and he was wearing jeans and an undershirt that suggested he'd dressed quickly. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown and startlingly gentle for such a large man. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Are you all right?" The question was so simple, so genuinely concerned, that Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. When was the last time someone had asked if she was all right, and actually cared about the answer? When was the last time someone had looked at her with kindness instead of anger or disgust? She started to speak, then realized she didn't know what to say. How could she explain 2 years of hell to this stranger standing in his doorway in the middle of the night? "Don't stare at me," she murmured finally, her voice barely a whisper. The words came out instinctively, the same phrase she'd learned to say to Marcus when the bruises were fresh, and she couldn't bear to see the satisfaction in his eyes. But instead of turning away or slamming the door, the man did something completely unexpected. He stepped out onto the porch and slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. At her height, he was no longer a towering giant, but simply a man offering help to someone who desperately needed it. "Nobody's going to hurt you here," he said softly. "I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my ranch. You're safe now." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet conviction, was more than Sarah's battered spirit could handle. The adrenaline that had carried her this far finally gave out, and she collapsed forward into the arms of this stranger who had promised her safety. Jake caught her easily, his strong arms supporting her weight as she finally allowed herself to stop running. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt truly safe. She didn't know this man, didn't know anything about him except that he'd been kind to a stranger in need. But somehow, kneeling there on his porch in the middle of the night, she knew her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. As consciousness faded, the last thing she heard was Jake's voice calling for someone named Elena, asking her to bring warm blankets and the first aid kit. Then everything went black, and Sarah slept without nightmares for the first time in longer than she could remember. When she finally woke up 12 hours later, she would find herself in a clean bed in a room filled with sunlight, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. But that first moment of safety, that instant when a stranger's kindness had penetrated the armor of fear she'd built around herself, would stay with her forever. It was the moment her new life began, though she didn't know it yet. Sarah woke to the sound of birds singing and sunlight streaming through unfamiliar white curtains. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, her body tensed for the familiar sounds of Marcus stirring, the clink of his belt buckle, the heavy footsteps that always meant trouble was coming. But, instead, she heard only the gentle sounds of morning, roosters crowing in the distance, the soft murmur of voices somewhere in the house, and the whistle of wind through what sounded like trees. She opened her eyes slowly, afraid of what she might see, but found herself in a room unlike any she'd known in years. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and sunlight danced across handmade quilts and simple wooden furniture. There were books on the nightstand, real books with worn covers that suggested they'd been read many times. A vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, their sweet scent mixing with the smell of coffee drifting in from somewhere nearby. Sarah tried to sit up, and immediately gasped as pain shot through her ribs. The events of the night came flooding back, the escape, the long walk, the stranger who had knelt down to meet her eyes. Jake Morrison. She remembered his name, and the way he'd promised she was safe. "Easy there," came a gentle voice from the doorway. "You took quite a beating." Sarah turned to see a woman in her 50s standing in the doorway, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She had silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her grandmother. She was wearing jeans and a work shirt, but somehow managed to look both capable and nurturing at the same time. "I'm Elena," the woman said, setting the coffee on the nightstand and settling into the chair beside the bed. "I help run this place with Jake. How are you feeling, honey?" "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly, her voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. "Where am I?" "You're at the Lazy J Ranch," Elena explained. "Jake found you on the porch last night, pretty beat up and scared half to death. We cleaned you up and put you to bed. You've been sleeping for almost 14 hours. Sarah looked down at herself and realized she was wearing a soft cotton nightgown instead of her torn pajamas. Someone had cleaned the blood from her face and hands, and her feet were bandaged. The kindness of these strangers was overwhelming. "My clothes. They're being washed," Elena said gently. "Though I have to say, they weren't in very good shape. I laid out some things that might fit you. They belonged to my daughter when she was about your size. She lives in Houston now with her own family." The casual mention of a daughter, of a normal family life, made Sarah's throat tighten with longing. She'd almost forgotten that families could be safe, loving places where people took care of each other instead of causing pain. "I should go," Sarah said, trying again to sit up. "I don't want to be any trouble." "Nonsense," Elena replied firmly. "You're not going anywhere until those ribs heal, and you get some meat on your bones. Jake's already called Doc Patterson to come take a look at you." "No." Sarah's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, panic flooding through her. "Please, no doctors. They ask questions, they have to report things." Elena studied her for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Honey, are you running from someone?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the fear that had lodged itself in her throat. "Someone who hurt you?" Another nod. Elena reached out and gently touched Sarah's hand. "Well then, we'll figure this out together. Doc Patterson is a friend of the family. He's been patching up ranch hands and delivering babies in these parts for 30 years. He's not the kind to go running to authorities unless someone's life is in danger. But what if he finds me? What if Marcus comes looking?" "Who's Marcus?" Sarah struggled with the word. "My husband. Sort of. We're not actually married, but everyone thinks we are. He has a terrible temper, and when he drinks..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Elena's face had gone hard in a way that suggested she understood exactly what kind of man Marcus was. "Does he know where you are?" "I don't think so. I walked here from his place, but it was dark, and I don't think he saw me turn down your road." Elena nodded slowly. "Well, even if he did, he'd have to get past Jake first. and I can guarantee you that's not happening. Jake Morrison doesn't take kindly to men who hurt women. As if summoned by his name, Jake appeared in the doorway. In the daylight, Sarah could see him more clearly. He was indeed as tall as she'd remembered, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors. His brown hair was streaked with early gray, and there were laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He was probably in his late 30s, with the calm, steady presence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice the same gentle rumble she remembered from the night before. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Sarah lied, then immediately felt guilty for the dishonesty. These people were being kind to her. The least she could do was be honest in return. "Actually, I heard everywhere, and I'm scared out of my mind." Jake's smile was warm and genuine. "Well, at least you're honest. That's a start." He stepped into the room and settled his large frame into the other chair, moving carefully as if he was afraid his size might intimidate her. "Elena tells me you're worried about someone coming looking for you." Sarah nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Can you tell me about him?" "This Marcus." The question was asked without pressure, as if Jake genuinely cared about the answer rather than simply being nosy. Sarah found herself wanting to tell him, to share the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long. "He owns an auto repair shop outside of town," she began slowly. "Everyone thinks he's charming, successful. He volunteers at the church sometimes, sponsors a little league team. But when we're alone," she trailed off, touching the bruise on her cheek unconsciously. "How long has this been going on?" Elena asked gently. 2 years. Maybe longer. It started small, just yelling, telling me I was stupid or clumsy. Then, he started grabbing my arm too hard when he was angry. Then, pushing. Then, it got worse," Jake finished quietly. "A lot worse. Last night he beat me with a belt because I burned his dinner. I was so tired, and I just wasn't paying attention to the stove, and the meat got a little crispy on one side. He said I did it on purpose to embarrass him." Jake's hands clenched into fists, and Sarah instinctively shrank back against the pillows. But when he saw her reaction, his expression immediately softened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at him." It was such a simple distinction, but it was one Sarah had forgotten existed. For so long, any anger in her presence had been directed at her, had meant pain was coming. The idea that someone could be angry on her behalf was almost incomprehensible. "Why did you stay so long?" Elena asked, then immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I don't mean to judge." "It's okay," Sarah said. "Everyone asks that question. The truth is, I didn't have anywhere else to go. My parents died in a car accident 4 years ago, and I don't have any other family. Marcus convinced me to quit my job after we'd been together 6 months, said he made enough money for both of us. By the time I realized what he was really like, I was completely dependent on him." "What kind of work did you used to do?" Jake asked. "I was a teacher. Elementary school, 3rd grade. I loved it." Jake and Elena exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't interpret. "We actually have been looking for someone to help with bookkeeping and some administrative work around here," Jake said carefully. "It's not teaching, but it's honest work, and it comes with room and board." Sarah stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to get back on your feet," Jake corrected. "This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, and we've always believed in helping people who need it. My grandfather took in more than a few folks over the years who were down on their luck. But you don't even know me. I could be lying about everything." "Are you?" Elena asked. "No, but then, what's the problem?" Sarah couldn't think of an argument that made sense. These people were offering her exactly what she'd been dreaming of for months: a safe place to stay, honest work, a chance to start over. It seemed too good to be true. "What if Marcus finds me here?" "Then, we'll deal with that when it happens," Jake said firmly. "But I can tell you this. He's not taking you off this property against your will. Not while I'm breathing." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet conviction, sent a shiver of hope through Sarah's chest. When was the last time someone had stood up for her? When was the last time someone had protected her instead of being the thing she needed protection from? "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she whispered. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the pastures beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My mother left my father when I was 12, he said slowly. He was a drunk and mean as a snake when he was drinking. She took my sister and me and walked out with nothing but the clothes on our backs. We ended up at my uncle's ranch in Oklahoma, and he took us in, no questions asked. He saved our lives. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes. What happened to your father? He drank himself to death 5 years later. But by then, we were settled and safe. My mother remarried a good man, my sister went to college, and I learned how to run a ranch. All because someone was willing to help when we needed it most. The parallel wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was another person who understood what it meant to run from violence, to depend on the kindness of strangers for survival. I don't know how to repay something like this, she said quietly. You don't have to, Elena said firmly. You just have to get well and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. Outside, Sarah could hear the sounds of ranch life beginning. Trucks starting up, horses nickering in the distance, the voices of men heading out to work. It was a symphony of normal, productive life, so different from the tense silence that had dominated her days with Marcus. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Of course, Jake said, standing up. Take all the time you need. But while you're deciding, you're staying right here. Elena will get you some proper clothes, and we'll have Doc Patterson take a look at those ribs. He paused at the doorway and turned back. Sarah, that's your name, right? She nodded. You're safe here. I know you probably don't believe that yet, and I understand why. But I want you to know that you never have to be afraid again. Not here. After he left, Elena busied herself around the room, straightening things that didn't need straightening and giving Sarah time to process what had just happened. Finally, she sat back down and fixed Sarah with a direct look. He's a good man, she said quietly. Jake Morrison is one of the finest people I've ever known. He's never married, never even come close as far as I know. This ranch is his whole world, and he works from dawn to dusk to keep it running. But he's got a heart the size of Texas, and he's never turned away anyone who needed help. You're trying to tell me something, Sarah said. Elena smiled. I'm trying to tell you that whatever you've been through, whatever that monster did to you, there are still good people in the world. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those good people find you when you need them most. Sarah lay back against the pillows, overwhelmed by the kindness these strangers were showing her. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end with Marcus Hartley. Maybe there was another chapter waiting to be written, one filled with safety and purpose and people who saw her as something more than a victim. Outside her window, she could see Jake working with a young horse in the corral, his movements patient and gentle as he coaxed the animal to trust him. Watching him work, Sarah began to understand that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole again with enough time and care. For the first time in years, she began to hope. 3 weeks passed before Sarah ventured beyond the immediate area around the house. Those first days blended together in a haze of healing sleep, Elena's gentle care, and the gradual realization that no one was coming to hurt her. Dr. Patterson had confirmed what they all suspected: 2 cracked ribs, extensive bruising, and signs of chronic malnutrition that spoke to months of living in fear. But it was the emotional healing that proved more difficult than the physical recovery. Sarah jumped at unexpected sounds: a door slamming, a truck backfiring, even Jake's boots on the porch steps. She found herself constantly scanning the horizon, waiting for Marcus's truck to appear on the road. She couldn't eat without forcing herself to finish, conditioned by years of being told she was ungrateful if she left food on her plate. And the nightmares came almost every night, leaving her exhausted and afraid to sleep. Jake and Elena never pushed. They treated her like a wounded animal that needed space and time to learn that not all humans meant harm. Elena would sit with her in the kitchen during the long afternoons, teaching her to can vegetables from the garden or sharing stories about her daughter Maria, who was now a nurse in Houston. Jake kept his distance mostly, understanding that his size and gender made him automatically threatening to someone who'd been hurt by a man. But slowly, gradually, Sarah began to notice things about Jake Morrison that had nothing to do with his physical presence. She noticed how he talked to the horses, his voice low and patient as he worked with the young colts. She watched him help Elena carry groceries when her arthritis was acting up, how he automatically took the heaviest bags without being asked. She saw the way he treated his ranch hands, the 3 Mexican men who helped with the cattle and maintenance, with genuine respect, asking about their families and paying them fairly for their work. Most telling of all, she observed how he handled her own fragile state. He never approached her directly if he could avoid it. When he needed to speak to her, he would position himself where she could see him coming, never surprising her from behind. He kept his voice low and his movements slow, as if she were one of the skittish horses he was so good at calming. The first time she laughed in his presence, they were all sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elena was telling a story about a particularly stubborn cow that had somehow gotten itself stuck in a fence, and Jake was adding details that made the whole situation sound like something from a comedy movie. And there was old Bessie, Elena was saying, stuck tighter than bark on a tree, bellowing like the world was ending. And this genius here, she nodded toward Jake, decides the best way to get her out is to grease her up with vegetable oil. It seemed logical at the time. Jake protested, grinning. Slippery cow, slippery fence, simple physics. Except you forgot that a greased-up cow can't get traction to push herself backward, Elena continued. So now we have a cow that's not only stuck, but sliding around like she's on ice skates every time she tries to move. Sarah found herself giggling despite her best efforts to remain composed. The image of Jake Morrison wrestling with an oil-slick cow was too ridiculous to resist. How did you finally get her out? She asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Jake's face lit up at her question, not because she was talking to him, but because she was engaging with the world around her again. We had to call in reinforcements, he admitted. Took 6 of us, and a lot of rope to haul her backward through that fence. And Bessie never let us forget it. Every time she saw me coming with a bucket after that, she'd head in the opposite direction. Sarah laughed again, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest. It felt strange, using muscles she hadn't used in months, but good, like stretching after a long sleep. There she is, Elena said softly, and Sarah realized both of them were looking at her with something like wonder. There who is? Sarah asked, suddenly self-conscious. The person you really are, Jake said quietly. Under all that fear and hurt, I had a feeling she was still in there somewhere. The observation should have made her uncomfortable, but instead, Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest. When was the last time someone had seen her, really seen her, as a person rather than a problem or a possession? That night marked a turning point. Sarah began joining them for dinner regularly, instead of taking her meals alone in her room. She started helping Elena with more complex tasks around the house, and even ventured out to gather eggs from the chicken coop. She discovered she had a gift for bookkeeping that surprised everyone, organizing Jake's chaotic financial records with an efficiency that made him shake his head in amazement. I've been running this place for 10 years, he told her one afternoon as she showed him a new system she devised for tracking expenses. And I've never known where my money was going from one month to the next. You just needed a system, Sarah said, pleased to finally be useful. And maybe someone to explain why keeping receipts in a shoebox isn't actually an organizational method. Jake laughed, a deep, warm sound that Sarah was beginning to associate with safety. Hey, that shoebox method worked for my grandfather. Your grandfather probably didn't have to deal with modern tax codes and equipment financing, Sarah pointed out. Different times. It was conversations like these that slowly began to rebuild Sarah's confidence. For months, Marcus had told her she was stupid, worthless, incapable of contributing anything meaningful to the world. But here, with Jake and Elena, she was discovering skills she'd forgotten she possessed. The first crisis came 6 weeks after her arrival. Sarah was in the barn office, updating inventory records on Jake's computer, when she heard the sound of truck tires on gravel. Through the window, she could see an unfamiliar pickup truck pulling into the yard, not the battered blue Ford that haunted her nightmares, but a newer red Chevy with commercial plates. Still, the unexpected arrival sent her heart racing. She crouched below the window, trying to make herself invisible, as footsteps approached the barn. You Jake Morrison? Came a voice she didn't recognize. Depends who's asking, Jake replied, his tone carefully neutral. Name's Bill Henderson. I own the feed store in town. Got a fellow came by yesterday. Said he was looking for his wife. Young woman, blonde hair, about 5'6". Said she might have gotten confused and wandered off. Maybe didn't know where she was. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus had found her. Somehow, despite all their precautions, he tracked her here. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description, Jake said evenly. But, then, I don't spend much time in town. Why would this fellow think she'd come out here? Oh, he's been asking around everywhere. Real worried, you understand. Says she's got some mental health issues, gets disoriented sometimes. He just wants to make sure she's safe. Sarah closed her eyes, recognizing Marcus's strategy immediately. He would have presented himself as the concerned boyfriend, looking for his confused and possibly dangerous girlfriend. He was probably telling people she was off her medication, unstable, possibly a threat to herself or others. Well, like I said, I haven't seen anyone like that, Jake repeated. But if I do, I'll be sure to call the authorities. Mental health issues aren't something to mess around with. Actually, he asked me to give you his number, in case she turns up. Said he'd rather handle this quietly. Keep it in the family, you know? Sarah could hear the sound of paper being handed over, and her heart sank. Now Marcus had a direct connection to the ranch. I'll keep it handy, Jake said. Though like I said, if someone with mental health problems shows up here, my first call will be to the sheriff's department. That's just the safe way to handle these situations. Oh, sure, of course. But this Marcus fellow, he seemed real decent. Just a man worried about someone he cares about. After Henderson left, Sarah remained crouched by the window, shaking. Marcus knew where she was. It was only a matter of time before he found an excuse to come here himself, to drag her back to the hell she'd escaped. Sarah? Jake's voice came from the doorway, gentle but concerned. You can come out now. He's gone. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady. He found me. No, Jake said firmly. He's looking for you. That's different. You don't understand. Marcus is smart, and he's charming when he wants to be. He'll convince people that I'm crazy, that he's just trying to help me. And then, nothing. Jake interrupted, stepping into the office. Because you're not going anywhere with him. You can't stop him if he gets the law involved. If he convinces them that I'm mentally unstable, Sarah. Jake moved closer, slowly, keeping his hands visible. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see doubt or uncertainty. Instead, she found only steady determination. I told Henderson that if anyone with mental health issues showed up here, my first call would be to the sheriff's department. Do you know why I said that? Sarah shook her head. Because Sheriff Martinez is a friend of mine. We went to high school together, and he's been to dinner at this house more times than I can count. He knows me, he trusts me, and he'll listen when I tell him that you're here by choice, that you're safe, and that anyone trying to take you away against your will is the real problem. The simple plan, so different from the chaos and fear that had defined her thinking for so long, was almost impossible to believe. What if Marcus lies? What if he has some kind of legal claim? Then, we'll deal with that too. Sarah, you're not a piece of property. You're a grown woman with the right to decide where you live and who you associate with. No one, not Marcus, not the law, not anyone, can force you to go back to a situation where you're being hurt. Jake pulled out the business card Henderson had given him and handed it to Sarah. This is his phone.